Conservation Institute. And as Kate mentioned, this was originally planned to be a panel session at the annual meeting, and we're going to try it online and see how it goes. This session is going to provide an overview of how the Smithsonian helps to protect and preserve cultural heritage around the globe. We've got a panel of specialists from the Smithsonian to provide overviews and case studies of our work before, during, and after situations involving cultural heritage. The first speaker will be Cori Wegener, Director of the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, who will give an overview of their work on cultural protection and disasters, with a focus on the Mosul Museum Project Zero, where museum staff from an international group of organizations documented the scene at the museum for evidence of Hague Convention violations. Then I will speak and talk about my unit, MCI's work with federal cases involving cultural property and in providing investigative agents with practical training in the handling and documentation of cultural heritage objects. Then the next speaker will be Bill Billeck, Program Manager of the Repatriation Office at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History. Dr. Billeck will give a summary of the repatriation laws in the US for Native American human remains and objects, and we'll talk about repatriations at the museum. And then we'll round out our panel with Jackie Swift, who is the Repatriation Manager at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. Ms. Swift will provide a brief overview of the founding principles for the museum as it relates to repatriation, the museum's repatriation policy, and how they conduct repatriations with Indigenous communities from throughout the Western Hemisphere. Feel free to put questions in the chat as we go, but we're going to hold till the end to answer anybody's questions, just so we make sure we get through our presentations in the allotted time. So I'm going to hand it over to Cori, and hopefully the sharing the screen works. Fingers crossed. Are you able to do it?
Thanks. We'll find out.
Yeah.
Do you see it?
Not yet. Is it not showing up?
Hang on, I think we're almost
there.
There
we go. There we go. There's just a delay.
Yeah, and then I just need to go full screen if I can. There we go. All righty. Thanks very much, Don. So as Don mentioned, the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative was invited to participate in the larger project of the rehabilitation of the Mosul Museum back in 2018, in fact. And some of you may be familiar with the plight of the Mosul Museum, that in 2014, the Islamic State, so-called Islamic State, or Daesh, invaded the Nineveh province region of Iraq and essentially took over the whole province, including the ancient city of Mosul and also including the Mosul Museum. But my task is not to talk to you about that whole larger project, which I could probably take a whole semester to talk about, but to talk to you about where we started. Before that rehabilitation could even start, we had to think about the implications of the documentation of such a crime to the level of destroying a museum collection during an occupation like this. And we got together, we were invited to start the project by ALIF, which is an NGO based in Geneva. You've seen a lot probably lately about how they're helping after the Beirut blast more recently. And then working also with the Louvre Museum and the Mosul Museum staffs themselves. And we had to think about how we would plan this. So the museum itself was built in the 1970s and built to its really real name is the Mosul Cultural Museum, which deals with several aspects of the cultural heritage of Mosul, with galleries including the prehistoric collections that they had amassed, Assyrian collections from places like Nimrud and Nineveh, the Hatra Hall from the archaeological site of Hatra, and then fragments from Islamic collections from mosques, etc., and ancient inscriptions that deal with Islamic history. So it's not a huge museum, but the collections were very diverse. As I mentioned, in 2014, ISIS Daesh took over Mosul, and by about 2015, in the early part of 2015, they started posting videos like this of the intentional destruction of the collections. And I'm sure a lot of you remember that moment, where it was pretty horrifying thinking about what of these things. There was a lot of speculation. Oh, most of these were copies. Most of them weren't copies. There was a lot of information flying around. What we did know then was that most of the movable collections had been evacuated to the National Museum in Baghdad back in 2003, before the US invasion. We know that a few of these objects were copies, but many of the collections that remained in the museum that were too difficult to move, that had not been evacuated, were still there, and many of them were damaged. So this idea took hold of that. This is a lot of responsibility, right? Our task from the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative was to help them with that initial stabilization of the building. The ISIS Daesh was in the building all the way up until the coalition offensive to take back Mosul, which didn't fully happen until 2017. And so here we were, years after the initial destruction, trying to think about how we could document what was left and what the damage was in a careful enough way that this evidence could potentially be used for war crimes tribunals sometime in the future, should that ever occur. And it was a heavy responsibility to think the documentation that we do before we start helping our Iraqi colleagues pick things up would be, the evidence that exists, right? Because we had to do it very methodically and carefully, and then keep it in a way that would be acceptable to future courts. And so who did we turn to, of course, to try and get some advice on this, but the United States FBI. And this is a moment where I want to say something about, there's an organization chaired by the State Department called the Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee, and the Smithsonian is a member, and so is the FBI and the Justice Department. And so this is a place where the interagency talks about some of these issues to do with international cultural property programs and projects that we're all doing, and to share information. And I started talking to Special Agent Jake Archer of the FBI Art Crime Team and thinking about how we could work together on this. And they offered to provide a training for us. And so I also want to thank Special Agent Mike Burns of the FBI Evidence Response Team and his staff in Philadelphia. And together, we did a training for this. And so I also want to mention Dr. Brian Daniels of the Penn Cultural Heritage Center. This is kind of his brainchild about how we could combine what the FBI does for all types of criminal activity documentation and crime scenes with cultural heritage. And then also, this is Sebastian Meyer, our mission photographer, who came to do training with us. Caitlin Averett from the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative was our program coordinator. And so I want to thank everybody who helped us think about how to do this. So without further ado, I kind of want to describe the methodology that we developed, or this is a little bit about the training we did. So we learned about, using these kind of standards that that document crime scenes in the real world and how they do it. And so this is just a little bit one of the training rooms that they had set up for us to think about this methodology. And so the idea is that you take a series of general pictures and then you go down to the specific. And usually when you're doing salvage and stabilization after a disaster for a collecting institution, a museum, a library, etc., you're more concerned with pointing out the damaged objects, figuring out how to salvage them in a way that you're keeping track of where it was found and whatever documentation is attached with it, taking good photos, and then numbering things and keeping track. But in this case, it's not just about the collections, it's also about things that you find that are not collections that could have something to do with the damage. So in this case, we're in this room we drop these evidence numbers next to things that look like they should be documented as evidence. And then, you know, you need to do sketches. I'm not going to be able to go very far into detail because of time, but, you know, we've all seen, you know, the procedural shows about law enforcement and how they do this. And so we're kind of taking on these aspects of that. You take, you know, up here in the upper left, you take your long shot with your evidence, you take a close-up shot, you know, use good, you use gloves, you suit up and everything, and then you take really close-ups with measurements of the objects and any markings that you might find on the object, in this case, the shell casing. We took a close-up of that, and then you bag it and tag it and send it off, you know, to the evidence room. So that was a whole couple of days of training that we did with our team. And then, but we knew everybody that we were going to work with wouldn't be able to take that training because we needed to take this to Iraq and share it with our Iraqi colleagues from the Mosul Museum and some of our other colleagues, for instance, the Gemma Art Group, which was the engineering firm we worked with, and our conservator, Kent Severson from Shangri-La Museum of Islamic Art and Culture and Design, and our colleagues from the Smithsonian, Jessica Johnson, Brian Leone, and others. And we had to share with them, like, okay, here's what we learned how to do this. How can we make a plan using what we know about the Mosul Museum? Everybody has to agree how we're going to assign names to the rooms, because it's like a ballet. You have to take the first series of entry photos without any people in them, but you need scale, you need a lot of information about what's in each room. And then you have to work as a team to go down to that evidentiary level, drop those evidence numbers, document, and then you have a standard where when you bag that evidence, you have to have more than one person sign off on it, seal it appropriately. So it's a long process, and those of you who are in law enforcement know all about this, but I was learning it for the first time. So it took a lot of collaboration about using the mapped plans of the museum, and then working with the director, Zaid Ghazi Sadallah, who was, you know, in charge. It's his museum. He was having his staff come in and work with us. And so we spent a couple of days ahead of time in Erbil at the Iraqi Institute for Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage, mapping out exactly how we would do this. Now, why did we need that much time ahead of time? It's because we knew, because of the security situation, that we would only have a limited amount of time on the ground. We worked with a security company called Pilgrims Group, who helped us develop our plan. They only wanted us to be on site for no more than 6 hours at a time. It's about an hour and a half drive from Erbil to Mosul, you know, and that's assuming you don't run into a lot of checkpoint issues, etc. So we wanted to allow ourselves this kind of time to make sure we planned so that we would arrive and immediately start work without any delays, even though most of us, almost all of us, had never been there before. So that was the key, was working with our Iraqi colleagues. So as soon as we arrived, we started doing the process. It's all types of exterior photos, looking out from the building, looking inward at the building, documenting the exterior. Now, some of these things are not necessarily what you would do in a normal crime scene situation, but we knew we needed the exteriors and everything for the documentation, because we want to rehabilitate this building. And the final goal of the whole mission was to determine whether, first of all, to document the damage and the criminal activity. We knew it was criminal activity. It wasn't possible, and we knew it. And then to determine whether or not the building was stable enough to be rehabilitated, because of course it had had fire. It was heavily damaged. As Daesh fled from Mosul and from this building, they set fire to the library collections and burned more than 27,000 volumes. And so we needed to see, could it really be rehabilitated? So while we were doing this documentation, we immediately sent the engineers to start their work, because they had a limited amount of time to work with Iraqi engineers to look at the building's structural stability. You can see this is one of the other reasons we were worried about the structural stability. On the left, you see the Assyrian Hall, and on the right, you see the remains of the Assyrian Hall. They, Daesh took lots of explosives and they packed them underneath this throne dais from Nimrud, and they blew a gigantic hole about the size of a Volkswagen in the floor of the Assyrian Hall. You can see these friezes on the left that existed prior to Daesh coming are now removed from the wall, and there are burn marks all along the wall. Over here you see these gorgeous Lamassu statues that were on the right are now completely broken up and actually sagging toward this giant pit in the floor, and this floor would literally bounce as you walked across it. So we were really concerned about the stability of the building itself. So just a little bit more, I'm going to speed through this process. It just gives you an idea. Those of you who are familiar with how crime scene documentation works, you'll know, but you do an entry photo, you make sure you're documenting everything, and then you just do this quick, and then you get a close-up of that, and you do a quick around the room 360. And you set up this methodology ahead of time. Like, we decided which place we were going to enter in each room and how we were going to do this. And so Sebastian had to be in there by himself for the first round, and then I came right behind him and I put down the evidence numbers next to things I saw. One of the things that turned out to be handy is that our colleagues from Pilgrim's group who were helping us with security were former military, and they were pointing out things to me that looked like they needed to be documented. So here you see a fin from a explosive device, etc. And then you need to focus in on those object numbers. So in the far distance, you can barely see an object number at a blast site where one of the Lamassu were blown off the wall. And now you see that close up. You can really actually see the blast pattern. We collected samples from around the blast so that we'll have a better idea of what might have done that. And then our team came in to do the initial drawings of the site. So you get to see a little bit of that, and took really good measurements. And we spent a lot of time working with our Iraqi colleagues, talking about how to stabilize things. You see these Lamassu were kind of sagging down. So we worked with them on stabilizing the building as well. And then this is our colleague Kent Severson down in that pit, looking at samples of stone and documenting with photos and trying to make notes about what he saw down there. So I'm just about out of time. So, but we're happy to say that we did a full report for the project to the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage and for the museum staff. And now we're continuing on with the project. We've had several visits since the visit to do the Project Zero back in February of 2019. So it's been a year and a half, a little more than that. And the process is going. The Louvre Museum has been helping with the stabilization of some of the objects. And you see here the recent visit of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Culture, and this is our colleague Zaid Ghazi, giving them a tour, and you can see how incredibly much work they've been able to do to salvage collections and rehouse them in preparation for the rehabilitation of the museum. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thanks, Cori. You've unshared. All right, we'll give it a shot and see if I can share now. Does that look good, everybody? All right. You can hear me. We're good. All right. So hi again. My name's Dawn Rogala, and I'm from the Smithsonian's Museum Conservation Institute. One of the things that I do is help with casework and training for federal law enforcement personnel involved in cultural heritage investigation and protection. So that's anti-trafficking, looting, fraud, and so on. I'm going to give you an overview of how MCI, I'm going to call it MCI because of course everything is an acronym in DC, of how MCI works with various federal law enforcement agencies to help prevent illicit trafficking and protect cultural heritage, including our involvement with training and casework. MCI, just to give you some background, we provide support for difficult collection and object care issues. We bring new research technologies and tools into the museum world. We leverage research with interdisciplinary collaborations focused on pressing issues in conservation, and we look for new outreach opportunities in collections conservation and study. We also work with other federal agencies. We support the Smithsonian's collections care work around the globe, from disaster recovery to conservation training programs for cultural heritage at risk. And of course, we act as subject matter experts, SMEs, for cultural heritage casework and training. The Smithsonian's a great place to look for SMEs. We're the world's largest museum research complex. We have 19 museums and 9 research centers, about 156 million museum objects and specimens. So that includes drawers full of bees, as you see there. We have over 6,500 employees, just under 1,000 research fellows at any given time. And that doesn't include the thousands of volunteers that we have all over the world, many of whom are experts in their own field. We deal with a wide variety of unusual materials, also traditional fine art materials. They may be exhibited or stored under a wide variety of circumstances. We deal with many types of fragile collections, including natural history collections. We deal with large and small objects, objects made out of mixed materials, objects that need to be accessed regularly, objects that need to go into long-term storage, etc. So you can see sort of where our expertise lies. There is, of course, a long history of allied arts professionals working to help rescue and preserve looted and stolen cultural heritage. I have to obviously reference the Monuments Men, the more than 300 men and women who served in the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Division in World War I. And that was a wide variety: educators, museum directors, curators, conservators, architects, artists. 2 people you might notice in these photographs. I think we've got James Rorimer, who went on to become the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and George Stout is somewhere in there, and he's sort of the father of modern art conservation. Having these kind of experts involved is really important when you're dealing with items that may be damaged or stored in difficult circumstances. For example, looting can result in physical damage to an artwork or artifact. And there's also the chance that items taken from looted sites can enter the art market. These images are from Palmyra in March of 2016, right after government forces retook the building. Sales of these items can benefit individuals, but research and press show increasing overlap between art theft and other types of criminal activity. Art crime has international reach, but there are plenty of examples within US borders. These images are obviously the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. Shot on the left is right after the theft in 1990, and shot on the right is a more modern image of the empty frames on the walls. It is a unique and fascinating experience to be involved in one of these cases, whether it's a criminal case or assisting with the return of stolen and looted artifacts. These are images of Spanish and Mexican artifacts discovered by Homeland Security investigators and Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers. It can be very rewarding to assist in the restitution of cultural patrimony and the return of stolen art, and in the repatriation of cultural heritage. On the left is a stolen Norman Rockwell painting discovered by the Federal Bureau of Investigation's art crime team. And on the right is a reburial ceremony of ancestral remains whose repatriation was facilitated by the Smithsonian. Smithsonian staff and collections play an important role in cultural heritage training for federal agencies. And I want to give you some background on the organizational structure behind one of these trainings. The Smithsonian is one of 12 US government interagency partners in the Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee, that's CHCC. The Department of State established the CHCC in 2016, pursuant to the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act. The CHCC coordinates diplomatic and law enforcement efforts to combat antiquities trafficking, disrupt trafficking networks, and protect against the looting and destruction of cultural property around the world. The Cultural Antiquities Task Force, CATF, is a working group of the CHCC. It was created at the direction of Congress by the Department of State following the looting of the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad. The CATF comprises 6 federal agencies that share a common mission to combat trafficking in antiquities in the US and abroad, and is managed by the Department of State's Cultural Heritage Center. Since its creation, the CATF has supported more than 95 domestic and international cultural property training programs, and works with international museum groups to identify endangered categories of archaeological objects or works of art in the most vulnerable areas of the world. And what you may recognize on the right, those are the red lists of endangered items. You can find that on the International Council of Museums website if you want to learn more about that. The training at the Smithsonian is called the Preventing Trafficking, Protecting Cultural Heritage Training. Funded by the Department of State, this training has been held since 2009 at the Smithsonian for a selected group of customs personnel and the investigative agents at the Department of Homeland Security responsible for cultural heritage cases. So that's Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI. This program, organized by MCI, with support from the Office of International Relations at the Smithsonian, and in partnership with CATF and the HSI Cultural Property, Art, and Antiquities Program, has now trained over 380 law enforcement personnel from more than 100 domestic and international locations. With the skills they have learned during these trainings, the US government has successfully seized, prosecuted, and repatriated more than 20,000 cultural heritage items to more than 45 countries. So you may have seen there was recently a special on 60 Minutes about the return of several Columbus letters to various countries. And I think there's a piece on the 60 Minutes website that talks about MCI and other Smithsonian experts that worked on that case. The 3,000 plus items from Hobby Lobby that were returned to their country of origin. Again, that's HSI. These are people who are coming through this training program. Training attendees work with collections and staff from across the Smithsonian, learning about object handling and documentation and about the material composition and physical needs of various objects. The most recent workshop featured staff from MCI, the National Museum of Natural History, the National Museum of Asian Art, and the National Museum of the American Indian. Through these workshops, law enforcement personnel learn about the physical needs of various objects while building relationships with specialists that can provide assessment and advice on individual artifacts. So I just did a cross-section of people here. We have Mary Ballard, Senior Textile Conservator at MCI. We have Jim Cracker, who's a collections manager at the National Museum of Natural History, and Antonia Curette on the right, who is a curator at the National Museum of the American Indian. Now, I want to emphasize here that we're not training these agents to authenticate these objects, but we are training them to handle, document, and photograph these objects. This is something that they were going to do anyway, and we're training them how to do it properly by working with Smithsonian experts and Smithsonian collections. This is the main training that we do at MCI, but our staff also lecture at cultural heritage training at other agencies. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of information that we might include on a talk on the handling and storage of artifacts. We might talk about what kind of surfaces you have to be careful of, surfaces that might be really fragile, like metal surfaces. We might talk about storage situations or storage containers that they may need to slow down or buffer the effect of the environment on an object, because changes in environment can really be hazardous for a lot of materials. For example, archaeological artifacts, they have acclimated to being underground, and if they are removed quickly and not properly, as you see on the left, they can degrade very, very quickly. So we talk to them about how to handle these kinds of objects. Or things like coins might be thinner and more porous and lighter than you'd expect if they had originally been buried. Cuneiform tablets in the center may not be fired, they're just air dried to sort of leather hard. That can be very, very delicate. There are other kinds of damages that can happen with changes in the environment. What you're seeing on the right is it's a version of glass disease, but it's essentially the transfer of salts coming to the surface of this glass, but it can happen with wall paintings, it can happen with ceramics. These are all things that we want these agents to be aware of. Also hazards to themselves. You know, natural history objects often have sorts of chemicals that can be dangerous, so we want to teach them about that. And while we don't teach them how to authenticate, we do talk to the agents about how subject matter experts look at an object and what analytical techniques we use and so on. The more the agents understand about how we think and how we work, the more realistic they are in their expectations. So the images here are provided by MCI Senior Conservator Carol Grissom. This is a slave badge that was being considered for acquisition by the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The image on the right is an X-ray that shows that the badge was damaged and repaired. So the text on the lower part of this badge doesn't look the same as the rest of the text. And in fact, under further examination with high definition microscopy, it became clear that the lettering on the bottom was carved into a built-up organic material. So this is kind of a pastiche between original and non-original. HSI training is the largest training that MCI hosts, but Smithsonian staff also collaborate with other federal law enforcement agencies. You may have seen the recent news coverage of the FBI's recovery of a stolen pair of ruby slippers that worn in The Wizard of Oz. The slippers were stolen in 2005 from the Judy Garland Museum and recovered in 2018. These are images from the press conference related to their recovery. The FBI contacted the Smithsonian because we have a pair in our collections at the National Museum of American History, and they were hoping we would have information useful to determining the authenticity of the recovered pair of slippers. Well, actually, we have done a lot of research on our pair of slippers. The National Museum of American History came to MCI and asked us to do analysis, and there ended up, you may have seen there was a Kickstarter campaign. We did a lot of analysis on these. Our pair is mismatched. There was we looked at that pair. We looked at a pair at the Museum of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. We also looked at another pair. So really, it's like we've looked at 4 pairs. And MCI head of technical studies, Dr. Gwen Cavich was in charge of this, and she also worked with other MCI scientists and fellows, working, of course, with National Museum of American History conservators and curators. There was a paper on this research in Heritage Science in 2018 that goes into this in detail, and these images and the images you'll see in a couple of other slides are from that paper. Our mismatched pair was really useful, because the FBI pair that they recovered was also mismatched, and their mismatched pair matched our mismatched pair, which is absolutely fascinating. Let's see, Dr. Cavich worked with curators and conservators from the National Museum of American History and was able to test the recovered slippers and compare that information to the in-depth analysis previously done, confirming that these were, in fact, authentic ruby slippers. You know, they different repairs in different bows, different foot pads, things like that. There's, let me see. There's not a lot more I can tell you about this because it's still an open case, but there's a lot of information about our analysis that is in that paper from 2018. And for those of you that are really into that kind of stuff, later on in this, I'll post a link to this paper in the chat because it's free for anyone that's interested. The paper covers a lot of really cool stuff, like looking at replacement beads. I'm going to use some of the science words because it's fun. So we used micro X-ray fluorescence to look at replacement beads. We also looked at the makeup of the different sequins. The dye was a very particular dye that was in there, the thin metal layering in there. I think that was using, among other techniques, micro-Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. I mean, you never quite know how your research is going to serve other things. And I think that's kind of the point of this. I mean, the idea here is that we have all these resources, we have all this knowledge that we can help train people, but also I hope what's clear here is, you know, we're working with these other agencies, and it's through us all working together that we're able to really impact things and do more than maybe we could do on our own. That's it for me. I'm gonna unshare this screen for a second and load Bill's screen and load Bill's talk because I'm going to hit buttons for Bill. So give me just 1 second here. We're going to close this. And okay, sorry. Yeah. And all right, Bill, you can see the screen. You just go ahead and tell me when to change things.
I'm hoping you can hear me. Could you
Yes.
confirm you hear me? Good, because for some reason, my apologies, is I'm able to participate and hear everyone else talk, but I'm not able to share my screen. Every time I try to share my screen, my video stops. So my apologies. We're going to try to work through this. It's going to be kind of old school. As if these were slides. So I'm going to talk about repatriation at the National Museum of Natural History. And I want to start by saying 31 years ago, the National Museum of American Indian Act required the Smithsonian to begin repatriation. 30 years ago, the year after that, another repatriation law was passed for the rest of the country. And at the time, it was a controversial law, and museums and anthropologists since then have come to embrace this law. Not completely, but to a great deal, where we now know that this is the right thing that we should be doing. But it was not something that happened at the very beginning. So I just, let's go to the next slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about saying that now we regularly have community members coming to the museum. 30 years ago, this happened, but it was not common. Next slide. Exhibits are now done in consultation with Native people. This is all part of the, I think, a result of the repatriation laws that have come about. Next slide. The Smithsonian also has a program called Recovering Voices, which brings indigenous communities from throughout the world to the Smithsonian, to natural history, to NMAI, to other museums, to work on traditional issues. It could be language, it could be traditional objects, it could be archives, it could be many different things. Next slide. Here's an example. We've had the Tlingit from Alaska have come in to study weaving, and they spent a good deal of time examining the collections and going through them. Next picture. Okay, so Dawn mentioned this a little bit, but the Smithsonian Institution is, I think, it more like a university system where we're not just one place. We're 19 museums. Each museum has its own collections, its own staff, and its own exhibits. For Native American objects and human remains, there's two major museums, Natural History and the National Museum of American Indian. I'm going to be talking about natural history, and Jackie will talk after this a little bit more about the National Museum of American Indian, so I'm not going to cover any of that. Next picture, please. Okay, the federal repatriation legislation, there's two. The National Museum of American Indian Act, we call it the NMAI Act. It applies only to the Smithsonian, and there's a 1966 amendment. NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which we refer to as NAGPRA, applies to any federal agency or museum that receives federal funds, except for the Smithsonian. It doesn't apply to us. That means that if Fordham University certainly gets federal funds in some way, NAGPRA applies to them if there are Native American collections at Fordham, which I have no idea what the answer to that is. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's when the first law that was passed for the Smithsonian, the NMAI Act of 1989, covered only human remains and funerary objects. In 1990, NAGPRA was passed, and it added two new categories, sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony. When that was passed in 1990, the Smithsonian was well aware of the differences, and that two new categories have been added, and we voluntarily use those categories as objects that could be claimed for return. However, in 1996, our law was amended to formally include those two categories. Next slide, please. I'm trying to move the slides myself every now and then. So there's the four repatriation categories. Interesting, human remains is not defined in the laws. It's just assumed that you would know what it was. The Park Service is in charge of writing regulations for NAGPRA, and they define it as the physical remains of the body of a person of Native American ancestry. Fairly straightforward, but we can get into some questions about some human remains that have been culturally modified. What do we do with those? But those are more complicated questions, and I'm not going to try to get into the complexities of any of these categories. Next slide, please. Okay, the object category, one of the three, is funerary objects. And this is an object that is part of the death rite or ceremony of a culture, was placed intentionally with human remains. either at the time of burial or later. Seems fairly straightforward, usually is. Next slide, please. Sacred objects. These sacred objects are specific objects needed by traditional Native American religious leaders for the practice of their religion by their present-day adherents. So it's an object that's needed today for a ceremony. So fairly straightforward, but we always have to see the evidence and the details of the particular case. Next slide, please. Probably the hardest category to explain and understand is cultural patrimony. This is an object, and it has to be an object that has ongoing historical, traditional, or cultural importance that is central to the group. It's so central that the object could not have been alienated or conveyed by an individual. And another important thing that we have to be aware of, that this object had to be considered to fit this category at the time it left the group. Cultural objects can become cultural patrimony over time. Some, when they're first created, are cultural patrimony. Some become important through time. An example I like to give is the Star-Spangled Banner at the Smithsonian. For a long time, it was just a flag. And this is an example for Americans as a whole. Is it an object of cultural patrimony today? Well, it's owned by all of us. Does it have sufficient historical, traditional, or cultural importance central to Americans? That people will debate that. I'm not sure the answer to that. Many people will say it does. Other people will say it doesn't. This shows some of the complexities of this category for Americans trying to think about it, never mind for Native Americans. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do we do this? We're to provide an inventory of human remains and funerary objects that are at the Smithsonian, and we're supposed to do that in consultation and cooperation with tribes. And how we determine if things are human remains and funerary objects, we need to use evidence, and we used evidence to establish if those objects are culturally affiliated with the tribes. One, that they fit the category, and two, that they're culturally affiliated. Once we've established that, we notify the tribes, and upon their request, we return those human remains and objects to the tribes. Next slide, please. So the major questions for repatriation. The first one is, who has standing to make a claim? And there's two groups: federally recognized tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations. Also lineal descendants. So if someone can demonstrate that they are a descendant, a known descendant of the remains that are in the museum, they have the first right to acquire those. Now, this law is only for U.S. Native Americans. It doesn't cover international repatriation, but museums can go beyond the law. So this is like, the law is the minimum that you have to do. Next picture, please. Other major questions. Is the object culturally affiliated to a federally recognized tribe? And if so, which tribe or tribes? Does the item fit one of the 4 repatriation categories? So how do we do this? Next slide, please. I keep on trying to change the slides myself. So we look at evidence. And for the Smithsonian and NAGPRA, we can use almost any type of evidence. So I can go through a big long list. Basically, we'll consider any type of evidence. But what's important, we're supposed to do this in consultation with tribes. Now, there are some differences in the Smithsonian and NAGPRA in the types of evidence that we have to consider. For the Smithsonian, we must use the best available scientific and historical evidence. So we have a really high standard of what we have to do in making our assessments. Under NAGPRA, it's a much lower standard. It's to the extent possible based on the information possessed by the museum. So museums under NAGPRA can do an evaluation a little bit easier than we have to do at the Smithsonian, or I'd say a lot easier in case. Now, do they do it that way? I'm sure some museums do, but I think a lot of museums use the best available scientific and historical information. The legal standard that we have to use when we make our decisions on what evidence is preponderance, is more likely than not. And that's for the Smithsonian and NAGPRA. Next slide. The Smithsonian collections at Natural History, to give you an idea of the scope of it, we have, for archaeology, U.S. Native American, we have 1.5 million objects. I think that's really an undercount. I think that's not, because we don't count how many objects are in each catalog accurately. For ethnology, these are objects that are acquired from living people. There's about 75,000 objects. And biology, we mean human remains. In 1989, when the law was passed, there were about 19,000 catalog numbers for human remains that are Native American, meaning that there's probably was about 19,000 individuals who were represented that were Native American at the National Museum of Natural History. By far the largest collection of human remains that are Native Americans in the United States. So that's what we have to deal with. And we work throughout the country with tribes throughout the nation. And I'm going to give one example. Next slide, please. And that's for just one human remain and one object. So this is just two. And this is a case that took several years to undertake. And Sitting Bull was a Lakota Sioux, very prominent. I hope you all know his name. What's significant here, he was killed in 1890 just outside of Fort Yates while being arrested. And his body was transported to a military post. While at the military post, an Army doctor had possession of his body overnight. The Army's doctor was Dr. Diebel. And I know all these things now, but at first I didn't know any of these things. Dr. Diebel, when he had possession of his body, took a lock of hair, cut off a lock of hair from Sitting Bull's head, and took his cloth leggings and took them when he left Fort Yates, and he moved to Georgetown, just outside of Washington, D.C. In Georgetown, 6 years after Sitting Bull's death, he loaned a lock of hair and leggings to the museum, and they were here since then as a loan. So the question is, what do we do now? Now, we didn't learn about this until about 2000, that we had this lock of hair and cloth leggings. And what we did then is we contacted all the tribes in the U.S., the Sioux tribes in the U.S., to let them know that we had these. And we began doing background work to figure out what we should do. Can I have the next slide, please? And some of the questions we had are, does the lock and leggings fit a repatriation category? And it's pretty easy to say that the human remains are, the lock of hair is human remains. That was fairly straightforward. But the leggings were not buried with Sitting Bull. They're not funerary objects. They don't fit sacred objects. They're just a plain pair of pants, basically. And they're not objects of cultural patrimony. So they didn't fit a repatriation category. But the Smithsonian has a policy that if we're concerned about how someone acquired ownership of an object, in this case the leggings, we can return them to the proper party. And we believe that the leggings, because they were basically taken off Sitting Bull's body, were not appropriately acquired. And so then we had two objects that the hair and the leggings that we could return. The next question we had is who has standing? And we do know that lineal descendants have standing higher than federally recognized tribes. And both the tribe and lineal descendants were identified. Because lineal descendants have priority over the tribe, we worked with the lineal descendants. We discovered who the closest living descendants were and offered to return the lock of hair and leggings to them. Next slide, please. And then in 2007, the lock of hair and leggings were returned to them. So this was a successful case that took about 4 years to unfold, and I haven't talked about every aspect of it. So I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Let me just stop sharing here. And we're going to go on to Jackie. Can you share your screen? And you have your mute on, by the way, Jackie.
Unmute. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. All right. Let's see if we can make this happen. All right. So, you know what? Many thanks to Kate Kaplan. I hope she's weathering the storm okay. And thank you, Dawn, for wrangling us. I know it's been like kind of herding cats, so we really appreciate that. And you know what? Thanks for the opportunity to be here and share a little bit about NMAI's repatriation program. And you know, it's an honor to be here and on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. But admittedly, I was a little surprised because, you know, repatriation doesn't necessarily align with the same principles as cultural heritage preservation. Nonetheless, I am excited to talk with you about NMAI's repatriation program and also share perspective about an Indigenous community's right to self-determination, including the idea of viewing that through the lens of viewing repatriation through the lens of human rights legislation. And so to understand sorry, I got ahead of myself there. To understand who we are as a museum today, it's important to have a general sense of how the laws and policies and science and all of that intersected with Native lives from a historical perspective. It's also important to look at Native peoples today, and you know, based on that history, I hope to convey why and how the NMAI is a museum of living cultures. Having said that, during we're going to look at these slides and most of these slides in this vast sections of time in these eras. And, you know, during this mass expanse of time, tribal nations were, in these first two major eras, they were largely sovereign nations. They created treaties with other sovereign nations like the Netherlands and Spain and England and France. And during pre and post-independence, tribal nations were recognized as having owners of their own lands. And just 2 years after independence, although they were recognized as having inalienable Aboriginal title to their lands, it also marked the first time where we had our first federal law with tribes, which was the 1790 Indian Non-Intercourse Act. So this was the beginning times of treaty making too, right? So the government was starting to make treaties with the tribes, and but it also was the start of when government began setting aside land boundaries, i.e. reservations. So in this latter part here, it's called, you know, the agreement between equals, but clearly you can start to see a shift that's happening in the balance of power. So in the early to mid-19th century, there was this rising wave of national capitalism that swept the country. It culminated into a national doctrine of white American expression to justify a divine belief in God's will for them to expand across the continent. And because tribes were considered inferior, they would have to be removed, religiously enlightened, or quite frankly, destroyed. This national doctrine was called the Manifest Destiny. And so too began the dawn of a new legal definition attributed to tribal nations who were referred to as domestic dependent nations. The origin of the title was formed from the Christian doctrine of discovery and the coupled that with the colonial law of discovery. And, you know, even today, it's kind of hard to stomach the thought of the Supreme Court ruling that said, quote, though they are humans, natives are inferior heathens rightfully subjugated and in need of protection, end quote. The important note here is well, not only was that dehumanizing, but the court ruling established this legal framework for the political relationship between US governments and federally recognized tribes, and that's still in existence today. And history also tells us that President Andrew Jackson signed the 1830 Indian Removal Act for the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole tribes. And from 1831 to 1839, tribes were forcibly removed from their original homelands in the east to Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. And this would be called the Trail of Tears. And thousands would die along the way from starvation and disease and exposure. And just as a side note, my husband's Choctaw, and his family was originally from Mississippi. And the Choctaws were the first to leave their homelands in a series of waves. And his family was in the first wave to leave in 1831. So, you know, it represents the direct outcome of those historical events and why he was born and raised in Oklahoma. And there's another side interesting note. His brother is currently one of 12 councilmen for the Choctaw Nation, whose population now is about approximately 200,000. You know, and it wasn't just the law that had a profound impact on Native peoples. Even the law, coupled with this mentality that merged with race-based science and policy, and this also had a particularly devastating impact on Native peoples in the 19th century. You know, as a precursor to the eugenics movement, there was policies in place that called for the collecting of Native human remains from like battlefields and graves, all in order to rationalize a Native inferiority and justify European descent superiority. And I've heard actually the allotment and assimilation era referred to as the second Indian removal. And by this point in time, we know that the tribes were already on reservations. However, even the government reservation boundaries were beginning to interfere with westward expansion, especially with the discovery of gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota and oil in Oklahoma. So obviously the government needed a solution, right? And the Dawes Act was touted as that solution to the Indian problem. The act ostensibly further divested tribes from their lands, issued allotments, forbid traditional practices and way of life, and continued to push Native people into mainstream America through forced assimilation. And as you can see from this photo, the Indian Wars were still going on. And in case you're not familiar with this photo, this is a picture of Geronimo, along with 3 Chiricahua Apache warriors who were also his relatives. You can see his brother-in-law was there on the left, and his son was in the middle, and his cousin. And this picture was taken about 6 months before he and his band agreed to a final surrender. And, you know, although the latter half of the 19th century was, you know, we're getting toward the end of the Indian Wars, it was really just the beginning of a new trauma for Native peoples. we see the other important part of that equation is, I think is important to know about, is the policy failures. This is one of them, the policy failures from the physical, the emotional, psychological scars that were left behind from the boarding school experience. This was the fate for many Indian families, regardless if they were involved in any wars or battles. And if you would allow me a little leeway here, I'd like to make a little personal point of reference. So I'm Comanche and Fort Sill Apache, right? And Fort Sill Apache is the Chiricahua Warm Springs Apache. And my relatives were part of the group that would become known as the group that was part of Geronimo's surrender in 1886. And they were told they would be held for 2 years, and that they would be allowed to return home. But instead, they were held for 27 years. And this included not only the men, but women and children too. My relatives were sent to the Carlisle boarding school, all in an effort to strip their cultural identity and reimagine them as Americans, but still Americans without rights. This far left picture is a picture of my great-great-grandfather, Talbot Gooday. And he actually received his first name at Carlisle, you know, and they got them there and they got them off the train and they would line them up in a row and they would just go down the alphabet. You know, there was somebody from there, Asa, he was obviously toward the end of the alphabet, Talbot. And that's how they would get their first names. And what's tragically ironic is that we are, again, debating the issues of tearing kids away from their families. I mean, even as we speak. But back then, this was considered part of the solution to the Indian problem. And because they were held as prisoners of war for so long, there were children born into prisoner of war status by virtue of being born. It seems so long ago. But it really wasn't, and well, or maybe I'm just old. But I'm actually old enough to have known the last one of the last children born into prisoner of war status. Her name was Mildred Cleghorn. She later went on to become the first elected tribal chairperson for the Fort Sill Apache tribe, and she was a lovely, graceful lady. I'm also honored to have briefly known Alan Hauser, who was one of the first born into freedom. He went on to become an accomplished artist and later received the National Medal of the Arts presented to him by President Clinton, as shown in this photo. By the way, Mildred and Alan were cousins. So well, everybody was related, right? This artwork in the middle is actually one of his signature styles that he did in the latter part of his life. And there's also pictured on the right is the current Fort Sill Apache Tribal Chair. Her name is Lori Goody. I'm proud to say she's also my cousin. And you know, I've never shared, you know, this part in a public forum before, but in this context, I felt like it really helped place you know, place things a little bit more into a context, this historical context, and provide a sense of humanity that sometimes is lacking in that process of understanding and in that thinking of the day. Well, it certainly provides an understanding for how we ended up in Oklahoma. Okay, so all right, so now that I've taken my personal moment, let me just keep moving on. So in this timeline, so during this era, we know that the government was there, they kept up the pressure and inflicting the process of stripping away lands from the tribes. And this photo, this poster here provides an indication of that. You know, you could land for sale and it would provide free and clear title, and obviously there would be surplus lands left. Or as the poster indicates, perfect title. And so toward the end of the 19th century, there was also this, Americans were coming up with the understanding, there's this epiphany, right? There's a belief that Native people were vanishing. And there was a lot of devastation going on, but, there was this epiphany going on. But despite the fact that many of the issues that led to this line of thinking were created and sanctioned by the federal government because of its action or inaction. And tribal nations really did take a hit in their populations in the late 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. And it was also during this time that anthropologists and religious pundits took it upon themselves to further divest indigenous communities of their cultural items and ancestral remains in order to preserve their cultural memory in museums. Well, instead of supporting them as human beings with rich cultures and religions of their own. And so shortly after that, the Antiquities Act was passed. So the act was passed intended to protect and preserve objects excavated from archaeological sites for the benefit of public knowledge. So if you look at that in relation to where Native people were at the time, in this sort of historical era, there wasn't anybody to speak up. There was no voice that was able to stand up to say that the remains of their ancestors were not antiquity resource objects, but rather recognizing that they were someone's father, someone's mother, somebody's son or daughter, someone's family, right? These were their ancestral remains who practiced their customs and religions, their religious lifeways and freedom. And I mean, that's who they were. So moving up a bit in time, after World War II, the pending cost of reconstruction for Germany and Japan, the government wanted out of the Indian business. They didn't want to have to keep worrying about the mess they'd made out of the assimilation policies and the treaty obligations. So the government's solution was the Indian Reorganization Act. And so the act intended to loosen federal controls and make tribes kind of more like corporations, right? Really to accelerate this self-governance process. Sounds good in theory, yeah. But the tribes weren't ready. They didn't have the infrastructure and support in place, not to mention the federal government's attempt to blatantly disregard any obligations entitled to the tribes from over 500 treaties that were signed between 1778 and 1871. Nonetheless, the act began the process of dismantling the tribes. And this led to what you could call the third Indian removal. So legislation passed in 1953 was intended to terminate federal assistance and disband tribes and sell their lands again. And that was quickly followed by the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. So this would surely solve the government's treaty obligation, right? Well, some 10 years earlier, Native people were starting to get organized. There was a group of folks that were, it wasn't just the tribes individually, but there were people coming together to start to get organized. And they developed this organization in Washington, D.C. in 1944. And they founded this advocacy organization so that they could be the eyes and ears and advocates for them in a diplomatic way in Washington, D.C. So now things are starting to change a little bit. In the US in the 1960s, it's generally speaking, that was a very turbulent time in the US, right? You had the Vietnam War going on, you've got the civil rights movement going on, and all circling around all of this, you've got human inequality and you've got discrimination issues. The 1960s also marked a major shift in Indian country. And this began the era that we're currently in, the tribal self-determination era. And for better or for worse, it wasn't until a militant protest group called American Indian Movement, or AIM, brought the issues of Native peoples to the world stage. As an organization, they weren't perfect in many of their past actions, but they did have an impact on about bringing national awareness to Indian issues. And so while both groups had vastly different approaches to the same issues, in many ways their overarching goals to improve the lives of Native peoples and reinforce tribal sovereignty, they were the same for both groups. We got another score in 1970, this says 76, should be 78, sorry about that, with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And you can see Native people are really starting to push back now, rightfully so. They were also trying to get access to museums to understand where their ancestors had been taken. And if we really fast forward, you know, all of this to say that the past laws and events that span this vast range of time, over 500 years in Native history, going from equals to savages, from domestic dependent nations to vanishing peoples, to objects of resources of antiquity, back to sovereign nations, now with human rights legislation. You could argue that because of the combination of those two contrasting Native forces that began in the 40s and strengthened in the decades to follow, that would help pave the path for the creation of the National Museum of the American Indian in 1989. And the NMAI represents the tenacity of Native peoples to persevere through some of the most inhumane and demoralizing government laws and policies. All of these eras in Native history helped to shape the founding principles of the NMAI. And we celebrated that tenacity on September 21st, 2004. And as you can see that the NMAI, it is a museum of living cultures, and it represents Indigenous peoples from throughout the Western Hemisphere. By the way, that little girl there, that's my daughter, my baby. And kind of switching gears to repatriation, you know, like in repatriation, other than the physical act of returning items, the single most important thing that we do in repatriation is consult. In a nutshell, it's the cornerstone to our community engagement. The unique caveat here is that the law says that we are not limited by the minimum standards set forth in the legislation. And so we take that to heart, which is why and how the NMAI repatriation policy goes above and beyond the legislation and allows us the flexibility to work internationally, for example. And we do so to correct the historical wrongs with the hopes that in some small way it will assist in reconciliation and healing. And all this usually starts with the consultation process. And so based on our policy, we maintain a government-to-government relationship. So what we apply domestically is what we apply internationally. And just as a caveat for Canada, Canadian First Nations have a very similar process to US. They have a similar political relationship, I should say, with the Canadian government, as do US tribes here with the US government. And so it's easier when we work internationally with Canadian First Nations. In Latin America, however, it's a little bit different. Oftentimes they don't even recognize their Indigenous peoples. And so it's a very different process. So what we do is we establish contact at the highest levels of government and then work our ways down to the appropriate communities. And so this slide—
2 minutes, sorry.
Sorry?
2 minutes, sorry.
I'll be done. So this slide represents the culmination of several years of planning to get to the point of signing this MOU with the Ecuadorian government. And we actually had plans to conduct this repatriation this past April, but because of COVID, unfortunately, we weren't in a place to do that. We hope to do that in the next year or so. 2 more quick slides. This one very quickly is just to say that at the end of the day, it really is about having the right people at the right place at the right time, and you can move diplomatic mountains with that. And last but not least, in the past 2 years, we have worked very hard to update a policy definition in a way that continues the NMAI's principles and the contemporary views of Native human rights. Most importantly, the new definition shifts the authority back to Indigenous people so that they can seek the return of ancestral remains in a manner that they determine to be culturally appropriate. So regardless if the human remains were naturally shed, freely given, or culturally modified. It marks a major milestone in NMAI's repatriation program, and especially considering the previous definition had been part of our history since the first policy back in the early 90s. And so with that, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jackie. I think that really gives such a great background to all of these other objects that we're talking to as well, the stories that are behind everything that we're trying to keep in their communities of origin or get back to their communities of origin, and protect in their communities of origin, all the reason that we're doing all of this. And we were all getting onto here are the laws and here's the organizational government stuff, but it's really wonderful to get more of the personal work behind it, which again is so important. I don't know if Kate, if you want to run the chat, or somebody mentioned to me, I said World War I instead of World War II with the monuments men. Sorry, I meant World War II. Sorry.
If y'all want to go ahead, if I see we already have a few questions in the Q&A, any of the questions from Deanna are from LCCHP. So introduce her. She's one of our lovely interns. So if y'all want to, they should be directed at specific people. So
you want Cori in there. Do you want to start with the Cori question?
Yeah, start
Cori,
from the top.
Oh, am I reading it? Okay. Oh, it says, are there any pro bono opportunities to assist with any of your work? Well, we have a number of interns that work with us on our cultural heritage mapping projects. At the moment, with the Mosul Museum project, no, that's kind of like, that's done for the most part. We're doing some training for our colleagues going forward about, you know, how to work in renovating your museum, and we're going to be, you know, working with them on the rehabilitation of the building. On the legal side, it's kind of new for us to be so focused on that, but I'll keep that in mind, thinking about opportunities for pro bono work. It's a good idea.
I think the next two questions are for Jackie. So is there
well,
still
Jackie and Bill can answer that bottom one, I think.
Perfect.
What are the difficulties encountered in the repatriation of Amerindian? I think both Jackie and Bill could.
Yes. So whoever wants to answer first. Bill?
You have your mute on, Bill.
I'm back. Do you want me to answer the first one, or I think both Jackie and I can answer both these questions. And the first one is, there's still improvement that needs to be done in how museums and institutions approach telling the story of American Indians. And I won't speak for Jackie, but I'll just say the only way to do this is to work with Indigenous communities and to get their approach to these things. And if if a museum tries to tell the story without consulting, it's going to be an incomplete story, and it may get many things wrong. So I'll throw the rest of the, if Jackie wants to answer this question also.
I would agree. I would totally agree with that, Bill. And consultation for us, even in repatriation, our bumper sticker is like, all roads lead to consultation. When in doubt, all roads lead to consultation. But most importantly here, it's about consulting with folks, but it's also about partnering with them and allowing them to be at the forefront of sculpting that story and in partnership. So that's definitely a huge component of that. And no matter what, at the end of the day, even if you think you've improved, you still need improvement. There's always room for improvement. So the next question is, what advice would you offer someone interested in advocacy for Indigenous peoples? Oh gosh. Oh, I'm so glad that you asked that question, whoever that is, Deanna. Thank you, because that's a really great question. So there are so many ways to get involved. There's the National Congress of the American Indians. There's Native American Rights Fund. There are so many issues that are out there. You know, murdered and missing Indigenous women, voter suppression. I mean, just there is really so many issues that Native people would love all kinds of people to support. And it's kind of like, if you look at this from the movement of Black Lives Matter. I mean, now we're seeing everybody coming out to support, and it really has, you know, like turn the page on it's not just one group, it's everybody. And so the more people that can get involved in advocacy issues for Indigenous people is fantastic.
What about that bottom question? What are some difficulties encountered in repatriation of Amerindian objects?
You want to start with that, Bill?
Go right ahead, Jackie.
So I'm wondering about the word Amerindian. I'm a little kind of thrown off by what the concept and what the meaning of that is. But I'll answer this in the way that my kind of brain thinks about this. Some of the difficulties that we have in repatriating items back, say, human remains and associated funerary objects. One of the biggest challenges that we face and that tribes face is finding appropriate burial spaces. It's really tough, because the idea generally is that tribes would like for them to, for the most part, to be buried closest to where they were taken. And so, like, if you're one of the 5 tribes living in Oklahoma, oftentimes, you know, those remains were taken from somewhere, Tennessee, you know, Mississippi, Georgia kind of area. And so it's really tough to find appropriate spaces that are protected for reburial. So those are some a difficulty that's encountered. Bill, did you want to?
Yeah, I'll add something. As a non-native museum, we have, I'd say, trust issues, especially when we were asking tribes about zoo objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony, because we need information from those tribes to show that they fit those categories. And we're not, and some tribes may be very reluctant to share information that's secret. And not that we want to know that secret information, but sometimes it's hard not to divulge that when discussing objects. So I think we have to build trusting relationships. And both Jackie and I have been in this doing repatriation for a long time. So I hope that at least at Natural History, we've developed some trusting relationships with tribes. But it's always new people and interacting with new people in and establishing bonds that people understand that we're trying to do the right thing. And that may not always be people's first impression, because they're suspicious of museums, especially big museums that have a long history of collecting objects and human remains that tribes have objected to in the past.
All right, I think we have one more. I think anybody could answer it. So what advice do you offer to individuals passionate about cultural heritage protection and repatriation who are trying to break into the field? So I guess we'll start with Dawn and work our way down.
Okay, I'll go for it. Well, I believe there are cultural heritage law programs. So it sort of depends on where you're coming from in the question. So there If you want to come from the law side, there are programs who do that. If you want to come from the sort of boots on the ground side, preservation side, there are things like Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative that Cori was saying has these wonderful internships where you're mapping cultural organizations, cultural institutions that are near floodplains and things like that. And there's a lot of different interesting programs that are going on. So it is a little tricky. It's part of the reason that CHCC, Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee, was created, because all these different federal agencies are doing things with cultural heritage, but not necessarily talking to each other. So it was a way for everybody to learn about what everybody else is doing. So my best advice would be to figure out what path you're coming from, whether it's law or conservation or art history, and see what might be happening within that field that's already going on that you could participate in. That's my very overarching answer to that. Anybody else want to try that?
I'll just agree with you, Dawn, that I think you have to try to get some experience on the ground and not just have book learning, because when jobs do open, we get lots of people applying, and if you only have a degree and you don't have some experience either from internships or volunteering, you're not going to be as competitive.
And there's a lot of, if the experience that's available, for example, is a remote internship where you're doing documentation research and you're working in Excel spreadsheets all day to figure out data, that doesn't mean that you're not learning things about this. That is all that foundational knowledge that you need in order to be able to do hands-on, practical site work for things. So you're so much more useful if you start there, and then you're making those connections. So I just don't want people to be frustrated if they're looking for, sorry, I gotta shoo my cat out of the way, because it's, it's a virtual conference, so there's gotta be pets. Don't be frustrated if the first opportunities that you're finding are not, we want you to come in and work with Indigenous communities and be our connection to these communities. There's other things you can do that will build your education and build your understanding, so you have a better idea of where you want to pursue this career.
If I could just add one thought to that, which is with regards to the repatriation part of that question. So the idea of understanding and knowing a bit about federal and law and policy, I think is key to understanding and having a baseline historical context. That's one. The other thing is that if you have the opportunity to to volunteer with a tribe, to find tribes that are actively working in repatriation, because some tribes aren't, right? So, if there are opportunities where you could go and volunteer for a tribe in that capacity, if they have any needs, and I'm sure that everybody would love a little extra help. So that's a really great way of getting in there and getting to know people and understanding the boots on the ground. And from that perspective, I mean, it's one thing when you're on the museum side and there's an imbalance of power, right? And so, having that perspective from a tribe's perspective, I think is really helpful to understand the overall process. And then if you have the opportunity to intern, with like a place that's doing repatriation type internships, I think those are also great opportunities.
Tom?
Hi, everybody. I am Tom Klein, the president of Lawyers Committee for Cultural Heritage Preservation. I've been mostly an observer today, although I did help put this panel together. I want to thank our panelists for really fascinating educational presentations. All of them were terrific, and they showed us how much the Smithsonian has grown over the years and become such a vibrant, involved institution internationally and here in the United States. Maybe, Cori, you want to answer that question, but there have been 3 terrific answers to this question about how to get involved. You can imagine I get asked this question a lot by lawyers, law students, and sometimes even college students. And I could just fine tune Dawn's answer a little bit. Think about what you're really interested in. Are you, for me, it was litigation. For other people, it's academics or tax or museums. It's very hard to break in because the need for lawyers has not been fully recognized. But if you imagine 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the number of lawyers is going to be growing dramatically. I can't give you predictions of numbers, but the problem is that there isn't financial reward comparable to the need. So think about what you want to be, where you want to be 10 or 15 years from now. Follow Bill's advice to volunteer for organizations, or what Jack was saying about tribes. There's lots of places you can go. Write an article, but the people, as Bill says, who get involved are rewarded later. It's not enough just to have a strong academic record. It's enough, you want to start working in the field that you're interested in, and even as a non-lawyer, there are opportunities. So I congratulate all of you and thank you for your interest in this field, and encourage you to try to get involved and stay involved.
Also, LCCHP has internships, so if anybody is interested in an LCCHP internship, go ahead and email the email that you received the information for this webinar today, and I will try to make something work. We have 2 more questions, both from LCCHP interns, so thank y'all. I think this would be for Jackie and Bill. Do you think that the way that NAGPRA currently exists is effective in producing the desired outcome?
I will be happy to say no. Sorry, Bill, you can chime in later after me, but I personally would be happy to say no. I do not think it produces the desired outcome. And I think part of that is because, you know, just it's a law, and depending on where you're at as an entity, are you a museum, you know, an agency, whatever you are, do you follow the letter of the law, or do you or are you going to make folks like jump through all those hoops? And I think that there's still a residual mentality that's still out there where it's making it very hard for tribes to still, you know, make these assertions, and they're making it very difficult for tribes to, you know, claim items, claim their ancestral remains, assert those kinds of claims by a variety of needless tactics, and so something in the back of my brain also tells me that there's some of this old guard generation that's part of that that needs to retire and move off, but there's a lot of momentum moving forward, and with sort of the mentality changing on that, and I think that if there are places that, you know, follow the letter of the law or places that don't, and so it's not a consistent situation, because you have the law, and that law applies to everybody outside the Smithsonian. And so, you know, do they have a policy? Do they not have a policy? You know, how many hoops are they going to make you jump through? So it really is kind of a big, broad question, because it just depends on, you know, what museum, agency, or entity that you're working with, and kind of philosophically, where do they start from?
I'll jump in too. And say that one of the big problems also is the lack of resources for repatriation. For, you know, resources get sent to tribes, resources for museums to undertake this work. It's basically an unfunded mandate for museums and for tribes. There's a small grant program that NAGPRA puts out, which funds, it does give out money a year, but it's a few $100,000 a year, which isn't much when you consider that it's for for consultation, for research on collections, and for return, and in cases, reburial. All these are very expensive things to undertake. And at the Smithsonian, we're very lucky that we have staff that is basically appointed to work on repatriation. Other museums don't have that. Tribes often don't have that either. And so there just isn't the staff in tribes or in museums to do this as well as it could be done.
Thank you. I know we're over time, but we have one more question. So if everybody's okay with staying, go ahead and ask it. How significant would it be if the U.S. was a party to the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights for your work? Would the aspects of free, prior, informed consent would strengthen consultation and reconciliation process? So I think the same two people.
Well, I can add something to that very quickly, because we actually have a recognition of that in our repatriation policy. And we're in the process of updating our collections management policy. And I was fortunate enough to have worked on the principles part of that section. And so I'm like, okay, well, if it's in our policy, and our policy is an appendix to our collections management policy for the whole museum, I'm just going to bring it over there too. So that's actually listed in even though the U.S. hasn't signed on to it, it's recognized it. We support that, and we want to make that known that is that's sort of part of the thought process that we come to the table with. And when we're talking about the consultation and reconciliation, I mean, that's all part of that. And we try to be as transparent in our process as we can be, which was one of the issues with NAGPRA and the CUI ruling, which gets down into the weeds, where information wasn't as forthcoming. If remains or items were culturally unidentified, well, they wouldn't have to provide them in the inventory. So we take the reverse of that. We give them everything, whatever you want. We're like, here is all of it. Here's copies of it. Here's the inventory. Here's even contemporary. So I think the best part about that is that instead of making it an antagonistic kind of situation, making that more of a collaborative and transparent process, it is so much more fruitful, and it is it really does help with the reconciliation process to be much more transparent and forthright, and it's just common human decency, right? I mean, come on.
I think the next question also kind of goes to the same thing. I think it's more of a statement. So y'all can answer. According to international law, every cultural heritage inside the border of one's country belong to the same country. And I think that's more of a question as to how NAGPRA, why the US has something such as NAGPRA, I think.
Yeah, because if we're dealing with other countries, that's really a State Department question. The State Department deals individually with each country to work out their agreements about how we deal with those laws, because we obviously can't enforce another country's laws. So I'm not really sure any of the panelists here can answer it as far as internationally, but if it's related to NAGPRA, I don't know whether Bill and Jackie are able to answer that question, or if it's relevant. Or
Jackie, I think you're still muted.
I was going to say I can say something, but I don't want to feel like I'm hogging all of this. We do actually work internationally, And again, I mentioned earlier where, you know, we're sort of in the power position because we have human remains and these cultural items. When we work internationally, we are going outside of our international borders. We're going outside of the law, but it's based on our policy that allows us to do that. And so we do that in the spirit of the law. And so it allows us to do that in a diplomatic way. A comparison to that would be the Maori in New Zealand, where they are, when they're in country, they're the holders. When they go outside of their country, they're the claimants. And that when they go outside to request their ancestral remains back, they are in that claimant position. And so all of those things are worked out diplomatically. And you get so much more out of that process than as a requirement of law. It's a much more fulfilling process. So it can happen. And it's a shame that we often feel like laws have to compel people to, you know, people and institutions to do that. But it can and it does happen.
Let me add that natural history also does international repatriation, but it's a little more difficult because we have to involve the State Department, the country that the indigenous group is in, and the indigenous group. So we need all the parties to come together and have an agreement, because we have to work through the country, the indigenous group in the country of origin.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything to add? All right, I think we covered all of our questions. If anybody else has any more questions, feel free to send them to me and I can send them along to our panelists. Also, this whole webinar has been recorded with the exception of like the first couple minutes because I forgot to push record. So thank you to our great panelists for sharing your insight and experiences and for our great audience questions today. Hopefully we as cultural heritage practitioners and enthusiasts can take the efforts of the Smithsonian Institution into our practice and advocate for the protection and proper restitution of cultural heritage. If you want to learn more about the LCCHP and our work, check out our website at culturalheritagelaw.org. We are also very excited to have more webinars forthcoming. So please keep an eye out for that on our website as well as our social media. You can follow LCCHP on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And also, I'm pretty sure all the various Smithsonian institutions that have their own Facebook and Twitter. Yes. All right. Well, thank y'all and have a great rest of your day. We really appreciate your support.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.